Good afternoon, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center virtual discussion of an important new book, Beyond 9/11, Homeland Security and the 21st Century. We're fortunate to be able to connect you with the editors of this edited volume, which was published earlier this year by MIT Press, in part because the discussion raised by this book is so important, both for Canada-US and Mexico-US relations as we move after 10 years or 20 years since 9/11, we're moving forward. It's time to rethink some of those institutions and how we got here. And that'll hopefully our panelists will be able to help us understand this a little bit more deeply. Our first panelist, Juliette Kayyem, is the Robert and Renee Butler Lecturer in International Security at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she's also faculty director for the Homeland Security Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Previously, she was President Obama's Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at DHS and Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor, guiding regional planning and the Commonwealth's first interoperability plan and overseeing the Massachusetts National Guard. Following Juliette, we'll hear from Chapel Lawson. Dr. Lawson is Associate Professor of Political Science at MIT. He directs the MIT International Science and Technology Initiatives, MISTI program, and the Policy Lab at the Center for International Studies. From September 2009 through February 2011, Dr. Lawson was on leave from MIT as a political appointee in the Obama administration, serving as executive director and senior advisor to the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Prior to joining the MIT faculty, he served briefly as Director of Inter-American Affairs of the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. Next up, we will hear from Alan Berson. Alan Berson is a senior advisor to Covington and Burling, inaugural fellow in the Homeland Security Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, and global fellow and inaugural North American fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We're very pleased to have him as part of our team. Alan Berson was appointed President Obama's U.S. Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection and served as Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs, as well as Chief Diplomatic Officer for the Department of Homeland Security. He was President Clinton's U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of California, during which time he was also the U.S. Attorney General's Southwest Border Representative. He served as Vice President of Interpol for the Americas region and as a member of the Interpol Executive Committee. He currently serves as a member of the Board of Trustees for the Interpol Foundation in Geneva and has held a number of distinguished state and local government positions, including Secretary of Education for the state of California. Kayyem, Berson, and Lawson have edited this book, and after we hear from them, we're going to hear from Marta Liardi Anderson, who is Executive Director of the Cross-Border Institute at the University of Windsor in Southwest Ontario, who'll give us a Canadian perspective and commentary on how the book fits with the Canadian experience on their side of the border. I'm going to turn first to Juliette Kayyem to give us an introduction to the book. Juliette?
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Wilson Center and Chris and Marta and everyone who helped pull it together, your team there. And to everyone watching, we are thrilled. I was joking before we came live that there's nothing harder than releasing a book, except for releasing a book during a pandemic. So we are grateful for all the opportunities to share what was a long-term process. It began I thought I would just tell you sort of where we are and then turn to, I think it was chat next in terms of what we tried to do. So those of you who know Homeland Security and as it applies also to the North America safety and security apparatus, know that it hasn't had a lot of intellectual rigor behind it. Most Americans, let's say before the Trump administration, viewed it as a TSA agent at an airport. During the Trump administration, would view it more as a CBP agent. Either it became famous for the Muslim ban, or for the border wall, or for family separation. And for those who know the department and believe in its mission, it's been difficult to encapsulate what it is and what it should be. And so we started this project, and I give kudos to Alan, who really came up with the idea of just trying to get the people who could get out of the headlines, even though the headlines can be overwhelming, and try to envision what a Homeland Security enterprise and even a department looks like, let's say at the end of the century, if this experiment still lasts. Since then, it's been interesting. Since we started, there's been the Abolish ICE movement, the Abolish DHS movement, all sorts of political fervor, because under the belief that the difficult missions that the department holds, if put somewhere else, would be done better. And I think we all agree that this is the department we have, and better to invest our resources and time and energy in trying to have a holistic approach. I'm just going to end with this before I turn over to Chap about the different pieces of it, and I'll just go over sort of the introduction in my piece. One of the aspects of Homeland Security, or the challenge of Homeland Security, as we all know, is not the security part, but it's the homeland part. It's the governance issues around, it's the governance issues that apply to each of our nations, whether it's the US, Canada, or even Mexico, and their relations with other nations. Think of Mexico and mass migration, Canada looking eastward now to China, and how those play out, and their particular historic and governance challenges, strong regional governments, strong state governors. And that, I think, we saw in particular during COVID, where you just had sort of a disparate response, a 50-state response, a federal government that was delayed in its response. And I think it's important for people watching to understand, like, the security stuff is not the stuff that keeps us late at night. It's really the, how do you minimize risk in particular homelands that have very unique governance challenges. And so that's what we try to do. So I'm going to turn to Chap, but thank everyone again for being along on this mission. And I think we'll get the link up at some stage. We're going to be, I have it up on my desk, but this is the book. So Chap.
Well, thanks, Juliet, and thanks to everybody at the Wilson Center. It's really an honor. I'm a huge fan of the institution, and I'm especially grateful to Chris for organizing this. So there's a number of chapters in the book, and I won't try to go through every one of them, but I did just want to pull out one theme, because obviously border management and control of ports of entry and what goes through any country is a crucial aspect of Homeland Security. And that is one of the major themes of the book. We have several chapters dedicated to management of borders. And one of the interesting elements of these three chapters was that all the authors really reached consensus on how borders should be approached in an era of globalization. Specifically, that we need to move away from the kind of 19th century model of sovereignty, where nation states endeavor to protect a particular line in the sand or the snow, and control relentlessly what comes over that line, focusing mainly on what comes into their own countries, not worrying so much about what contraband or other bad things might go out. And when they focus on, say, targeting criminal networks operating across the border, it's really from a unilateral approach rather than one of deep collaboration with their neighbors. And what we argue in this book, among other things, is that we need to change the premise to one of smart borders or 21st century borders, or what we call collaborative border management. And the premise here, or the pretense at least, is that a joint approach to managing borders, especially land borders, will yield significantly greater benefits for all the countries involved than an uncoordinated approach. And the classic example would be a port of entry that operates only on one side of the border, so that people can go out but can't go into the other country, or vice versa. But we elaborate much more on this notion of collaborative border management to include things like attitudes toward trade, public safety, management of the environment and public health, shared equipment purchases, targeting algorithms, et cetera. But the notion is that we should be collaborating with our neighbors on all of these things. And obviously there are many barriers to doing so, but so far this idea has really reached its apogee in North America. And it's kind of incumbent on North American governments to not only identify the barriers, but to blow through them in order that we can all enjoy the benefits of 21st century border management in an era of globalization. So I'll stop with that. There are many other themes in the book that we can pick up on, but I thought that might be of particular interest to this audience.
So thank you. I join my colleagues, Christopher and the Wilson Center, and want to thank particularly Marta, who has agreed to join us to actually look at Homeland Security in the with a closer focus on U.S.-Canada relations, how Homeland Security, following up on what Chap just said, so importantly implicates the U.S.-Canada relationship. This book, in many ways, according to the old saw, or follows the old saw, that experience is what you get when you're looking for something else. When we started out with the book in 2017, the notion was to look at Homeland Security 16 years after 9/11, which was the signal event that created the Homeland Security perspective, certainly in the United States. But then also to take a look at DHS, which was then 13 or 14 years old, and to make an assessment of where Homeland Security was, this sprawling 240,000 employee conglomeration of 22 agencies from across the landscape of American government, brought together to address Homeland Security. And we thought that it would be good to bring together people who had served in the Homeland Security context in the Bush and Obama administrations, take stock of where we had come and what could be improved. And the experience of the last 4 years certainly has made the book, for reasons Juliet indicated, even more timely than we could have hoped it would be in terms of the changes that have taken place, not only domestically, but in terms of the bilateral relationship with Canada and with Mexico, and the tremendous change that's taking place in the world, and that is accelerated in part because of the disruption, not always unnecessary, but the disruption of the Trump foreign policy, including relationship with Mexico and Canada, for that matter. Yes, indeed, perhaps its most crowning achievement will turn out to be the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that replaced and updated NAFTA. But the disruption that we've seen in the world, the breaking of ties, even the lack of the kind of sustained relationship between the United States and Mexico and the United States and Canada that characterized both the Bush and Obama administrations, really has taken a back seat during the last 4 years, and hopefully will be addressed again by the incoming administration. Let me just, in terms of the perspective in the book, we really press the point that Homeland Security is inherently transnational. There's nothing that happens that affects the homeland that doesn't have a cause or effect generated abroad. And no more, and nowhere else is that true than in our relationship with Canada and our other land border with Mexico. In fact, when I left being the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, and I was asked to become the Assistant Secretary of International Affairs, Secretary Napolitano agreed with the notion that we should add that very odd title to my other title, Chief Diplomatic Officer. And that actually has something to do with the focus of our discussion today. The notion was, which was not, it didn't set out to annoy the State Department, but it definitely did, But the notion that Secretary Napolitano had, which I supported, was that, in fact, when it comes to dealing with Canada, there is no department that has a closer relationship with the government of Canada and its agencies than the Department of Homeland Security. That, in fact, the notion that our relationship with Canada is a foreign relation was something that she wanted to address. And I think the history of the Obama administration certainly was Homeland Security took the lead in our relationship with Canada, and in large respects touching on migration with Mexico. So this is a great opportunity for us to actually explore in greater detail, and with Marta's help and Chris with the Canada Institute's help, to look at how do we actually build back better this bilateral relationship that, yes, we did get USMCA, no small accomplishment, but a lot of the other relationships actually have not been built on or developed. And I think we have an opportunity because we have in the relationship between President-elect Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau, we have a relationship of trust and confidence. I think that contrasts, frankly, with what the Biden administration will find with Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico. They'll need to develop that kind of relationship, but there's a real opportunity here as we build out the themes that are taken up in the book to do so bilaterally, and to do so with a North American perspective that I think it will enhance the function and, frankly, the security and economic prosperity of both countries. Let me pause there, Chris, and turn it back to you.
Thanks very much, Alan. And I'd like to introduce our commentator once again, Marta Liardi Anderson, who brings more than 20 years of experience, both in advising policy and operational matters. She's currently executive director of the Cross-Border Institute at the University of Windsor, but in the past, she's been executive vice president for P3, which is public-private partnership for the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority. And I'm a native Detroiter, but I always assume people know these things, but I'll just underscore how important her role was by saying that the Detroit-Windsor crossing is the most high volume and important crossing on the Canada-US border, and in fact is responsible for more trade than any single crossing on the US-Mexico border. And so it really is central to our sense of how trade and the land border work. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Marta.
Thank you, Chris. And it's a thrill to be here with everybody today. I just wanted to pick up on what Alan said, and that the idea that the economy and security piece, one cannot exist without the other. And that is something we learned in spades during and after 9/11. And what we know here at the Windsor-Detroit crossing and in the region, Southwest Ontario and Southeast Michigan, is that the Canada-US economy is so integrated on so many levels. Most people would realize this referring to the automotive industry, but it's also throughout other industries, agriculture, pharmaceutical. COVID shed a light on the industry around personal protective equipment, the movement of essential goods between our countries. That integration is such a piece of that relationship that without the security moving with it every step of the way, that trusted trading relationship becomes endangered. So it's to everybody's benefit to understand how those two pieces have to absolutely move together. I think one of the things in reviewing the book and reading the book, which I thought is just very timely, and especially it highlights during this COVID pandemic, the things that we still have to work on. And again, that coordination piece is critical within government. We suffer the same thing here in the federal public service as DHS suffers on the US side. All of that responsibility that is articulated in the book, that is in different agencies and departments across the US government, but housed under that one umbrella. We have the same thing here in Canada. We have, the public safety and emergency preparedness portfolio is responsible for severe weather events, policing at the federal level, so the RCMP, the border protection under CBSA, various other pieces with the movement of immigration and some pieces of international trade. I did take a look at Minister Blair's mandate letter earlier today, and the sympathy that I felt for the man was just overwhelming. The number of initiatives that he has to coordinate on with other ministers and at the provincial level and municipal level is overwhelming. So that pain that DHS, I think, has felt, we feel here as well. So that continuous coordinating role is essential across government, across all levels of government, and then within the departments itself. I did want to say one other thing that I think is very unique about the North American experience. On the economic side, we truly have a trade corridor at play. And at the Cross Border Institute, it's one of the things that we continuously are examining. Then it really happens to be from the tip of the Port of Montreal, if you're going north and south, all the way to the end of the I-75. And in many instances, it either heads to the Port of Laredo or into California at other ports. And then the east and west across our own country from the Port of Vancouver, which receives merchandise from the Asia Pacific region and then gets dispersed across the country and then south again into the US. I think when we're looking at the way goods move across the continent, it's a very unique feature of the relationship that we have. And again, it speaks to the integration of our economies. The other thing is, I think, another unique feature in that, especially in this region in the country, it's personal. It's the family connections, it's the friends that live just 25, 30 minutes away, but across the river on the other side. So when we have an event like COVID, where both governments, the Canada-US government, responded remarkably quickly, probably and most likely based on the 9/11 experience, where we could keep the commercial goods moving, but we, I think, dropped the ball on the personal side of things. So I think we're still kind of working our way through that part. But I'll just stop right there, Chris, and let you lead the discussion further.
Thank you very much, Marta. I want to remind our viewers, if you haven't done a Wilson event recently, that we would invite your questions. All you need to do is email us at canada@wilsoncenter.org. canada@wilsoncenter.org, or you can send us a direct tweet. I find that a little more complicated, but you can. Our Canada Institute, @Canada Institute is our Twitter handle. Either way, those questions will come to me and I'll pass them on to our illustrious panel. Oh, and one small reminder, Wilson Center is spelled the American way, so T-E-R and not T-R-E, just in case Canadian spellings might creep in. So let me begin by asking about something that Marta raised. So much of this book is about how the department evolved. Now that we're dealing with a pandemic, a very different sort of threat than we built the Department of Homeland Security up for, how do you think the pandemic will challenge the department to respond, to reorganize? Does it need new functions? Does it need new personnel, or can it encompass this within the context of the structure we have today? And then maybe we'll ask about Canada as well. But can I turn to you to start the response, Juliet?
Yeah, so, I thought about this a lot. I think one of the issues is not should DHS have done something different or whatever? What did DHS do? And I don't mean this hard. I mean, in other words, it's lack of at least public engagement. I know FEMA's doing a lot with the, trying to get the stockpiles ready, trying to get surge capacity, even though the president hasn't invoked the Defense Production Act. But when you think about its capacity, and I'm not saying FEMA should be in charge, but just its network amongst a local, state, territorial, tribal apparatus, that's the emergency management side, the complementary side to the public health side. You see, I mean, part of it is just, we've got to get this department re-engaged in non-border issues, which is where both Chertoff in the second term after Hurricane Katrina, as well as Napolitano and then Jay Johnson tried to do, which is to really do all hazards, in particular on emergency management, even though it's always going to have that border management feel. So that would be one thing that I think is a key focus, is how do you repivot, an agency that started sort of almost exclusively as a counterterrorism agency, then pivots in 2005 to understand climate change and response capabilities, then begins to grow a cyber security apparatus, which by all accounts is incredibly strong and probably too successful given what's happened to it, or to its leadership, and then now needs to pivot back. So in some ways, I'd like to see them better integrated into the HSPD structure and to utilize those mechanisms. I'll just end here. So we're in this, what I wrote in my most recent Atlantic piece, the split screen of 2021. We're about to enter it, 300,000 US citizens dead as of about an hour ago. So the split screen of 2021 is going to be, we'll hit 450. I mean, I know how trajectories work. We'll hit 450 by February. And yet, the FedEx, and UPS trucks delivering a vaccine that will give us some relief. The second part is a chain supply. It's not like you could be transporting marbles. Like it doesn't matter what's in the truck. And we have almost no federal apparatus sort of nurturing what's clearly a very strong public-private partnership between states, localities, and the manufacturers, distributors, and supply chain providers. So that would just be one thought, would be, let's reintegrate the department into a lot of this response planning.
Alan, Berson, looking at this, particularly for the movement of people, airports and I guess individuals crossing the border, it overlaps a bit with the immigration mission. And there are obviously other countries that have required vaccinations for travelers and that sort of thing before. How do you think the department can handle health screening, even just preliminarily? Are there some mechanisms in place or some unique challenges that we haven't thought about yet?
This is a new challenge. I think just building on Juliet's observation, DHS is always one of the elements in the Homeland Security enterprise, which consists inevitably of many other agencies, the private sector, the media, the public itself, as well as state, local, tribal, and international partners. I think what we've seen in with the COVID, though, and this goes back to Marta's comment, integration is always a problem. Coordination is always a problem in government. But what has been conspicuous by its absence here, and it's so critical to the Homeland Security enterprise as a whole, is that there is some guidance, that there is some central guidance. And sometimes that will come from DHS, but often it'll come elsewhere. So I think in the public health function, DHS is not the central player, but it has a critical role to play, Juliet suggested, with FEMA, and certainly at the border. And CBP will have a material role to play in actually resuming the movement of people across the border, which has been as seriously curtailed with the agreement. But what we've seen it even in the U.S.-Canada context. Trudeau, Lopez Obrador, and Trump were very effective quickly in March in coming up with a trilateral solution implemented in the usual parallel bilateral way. But what we haven't seen since is any effort to talk about how do we address the issues that you've raised, Chris, which is how do we get the movement of people going again. It's been a complete absence of, as far as I can tell, national consultations between the two countries. In effect, as happened in this country with the Trump administration's washing its hands of that, providing that kind of guidance, basically saying if states and provinces in Canada want to start discussing that, that's fine. We're not going to provide a forum for it. We're not going to provide an incentive for it. And somehow we expect it to happen. As we go further, and the Canada Institute is centrally involved in many of these efforts, the health task force that you've established will be an incredibly important forum for starting to say, what do we need to do in terms of providing health passports? How do we scan people's temperature at the border? How do we actually create health passports that indicate, yes, I have antibodies because I've had COVID and I don't present a threat? All of these are the measures that we will see over time, and then they'll be incorporated institutionally into the Homeland Security and border management regime. But we do need to get this started. And what's frankly quite appalling is that we've seen very little thought in the government, between the governments, as opposed to think tanks like the Canada Institute or the Future Border Coalition out on the West Coast in Vancouver, actually rolling up their sleeves and getting to work on this. Absolutely essential that we build this into the border management, the administration of our borders. Yes.
Chapel Lawson, I'm going to turn to you to think a little bit. I know one of the chapters of this book, you and Alan look at the future of the department. It's always been a funny set of strange bedfellows, so many different lines of activity assembled into one. Do you see the continued interagency coordination, especially with Health and Human Services and the Public Health Service, as the norm, or does DHS need to take on more within its walls?
That's a really important question. But can I get in on the COVID question first? Because,
yes.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Alan and Juliet said, but I would add that COVID has really reinforced all the lessons we already knew about Homeland Security, but both the parts of the response that went well and the botched parts of the response. Because Homeland Security is, as much as anything else, an exercise in trying to anticipate the next calamity. And to anticipate the next calamity, one thing you need is sort of planning and red teaming exercises and tabletop exercises. Juliet writes a lot about this in her chapter in the volume. And we did some of those, but then there was no follow-up, unfortunately, with respect to the COVID epidemic. So that's one really important lesson. And then, I think another hugely salient lesson from COVID is that Homeland Security can't be, as Alan was suggesting, just a government function, right? Homeland Security is about the department forming the right partnerships with other departments, but also with civil society and the private sector. And where those partnerships work, the response to COVID worked well. And where those partnerships were broken or poorly established or there wasn't sufficient trust, the response was woefully inadequate. And so that I think is the second lesson. And then the third lesson to me from COVID is that although we think of Homeland Security as always having this public goods character in which everybody is better off if we have more of it and everyone is worse off if we have less of it, there are within that sometimes distributional consequences of policies, and we need to be sensitive to those possible distributional consequences whenever we design a response. So in the case of COVID, the lockdowns and and other government efforts, really the burden fell more on some parts of the community than on others. And also deaths from COVID affected some parts of the community more than others. And so these sort of ameliorative measures need to be part of any Homeland Security response to any calamity, not just COVID. So I went on a little bit too much there, but I think we didn't cover pandemics specifically as a chapter in the book, but we did call it out as something that needs further attention. And then the pandemic happened horribly, and I think it only reinforced some of the conclusions we had made more generally about the Homeland Security apparatus. You mentioned another lesson, which I think also is relevant for COVID, though I didn't emphasize it, and that has to do with the coordination inside the federal government. I mean, the way the US government works, as everyone who's familiar with that model knows, is that within the White House, there are interagency committees or councils, sometimes run by the national security staff, that coordinate across all the different government agencies with a stake in whatever the policy domain is. And DHS has historically, I'm sorry to say, not been the agency that brought problems to the interagency. It tried to defend its equities, it participated in those conversations, and where they occurred, that was beneficial. But in the future, DHS needs to do more than that, and it needs to be the one flagging for the rest of the interagency the problems. And that potentially falls on what's called the Transborder Directorate within the National Security Council staff. So if you want to really drill down, it's that senior director can play an incredibly important role in the degree of coordination that happens inside the US federal government.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And you touched on a number of issues I want to follow up on. I'm going to first turn to Marta Liardi Anderson. As you look at this from the Canadian side, do you see similar problems? And as to a resolution, trying to figure out how to deal with the pandemic, does Canada need the US to make up its mind first and then it can react? Or is there the mechanism? Do you have the sense that Canadian thinking can move in parallel and actually contribute to a joint solution?
Chris, let me start by saying and agreeing with what Alan and Juliet and Chap have mentioned. The idea of the coordination is it's an immense undertaking, and it's going to be a continuous effort. But where we saw a lot of success after 9/11 was the coordination with private sector and coordination with other stakeholders, including other levels of government. And we did see a lot of interest in reaching out to experts in the field. Those of us who've been working on border issues, infrastructure issues, supply chain issues for many, many years. That seems to have, over the past 18 to 20 years, fizzled off a bit. And perhaps there needs to be a re-engagement and a recommitment to those things, which leads me to say this. In order to make the best decisions at a government level, government officials need to have the best information in the moment that they need to make that decision. I don't think anybody would dispute that. I think there is an opportunity, and the book touches on this, to take a look at the role of technology and what does technology now allow us to do that perhaps we weren't able to do almost 20 years ago. And I would suggest that if we could even take a look at the most available data out there, which at the Institute, we do a lot of work with ordinary GPS data, but with application of AI or machine learning, we can crunch that data a lot more quickly than we did 20 years ago. So what are we now able to learn more quickly in analyzing a data set that will help us inform the decisions that need to be made? And with respect to COVID, I think we're looking at an opportunity where Canada perhaps can offer information and lessons learned through, for example, a pilot program that has been undertaken in Coots Crossing at the land border in Alberta. And it doesn't involve the US side. It's mostly on the Canadian, it's only on the Canadian side. It has its objective is to minimize the 14-day quarantine. So there's going to be lessons learned there. And of course, we would share that with our American colleagues to say, you know, here's what we've learned, and perhaps we can apply these things when we talk about the movement of people. And that's critical. And we're finding more and more how critical the movement of people are when we talk about that integrated economy. The tool, die, and mold industry in this area of the country, where there happens to be a cluster, is currently suffering from the disjointed policy application of their industry being deemed essential. But the movement of the people that make that industry function is sometimes essential, sometimes not. So it's a hit and miss at whether these essential people can cross that US-Canada border to work on a piece of machinery, to upgrade the machinery. But it even informs, Chris, the integration of business networks. How do we negotiate a contract at a multi-million-dollar level if we can't get into the same room with each other? How do we investigate whether X organization can do the work that we want to contract them to do if we can't go see their facilities? The technology is fantastic, but it's limiting. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at lessons learned, and based on the way things were coordinated as a result of 9/11, to apply them and then move more quickly through where we need to be.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. This is an interesting dialogue. We have a question from our audience regarding trusted traveler programs, and whether trusted traveler programs, first of all, could be a tool in responding, perhaps carrying some health information with them. But secondly, whether a recent decision to sort of harmonize the back end of Nexus, Sentry, and Global Entry, and also raise the cost of applying, will have an impact on the utility of these tools going forward. I don't know which way to direct the question. Maybe I can.
Let me take a crack at
Sure.
that, because it really builds on something Marta said. So after 9/11, we really saw regular contact between policymakers from Canada and the United States. And among the programs that emerged was the Nexus program and the Trusted Traveler program. The idea that, and it came out of a contentious back and forth between Canadian complaints that the border was being thickened. And I think that was heard on the American side. And after a lot of working together, we ended up co-creating the Nexus program. This idea that the best way to de-thicken the border was to actually, to mix my metaphors and borrow something the chap's written a lot about, we made haystacks smaller. We started not only looking for needles in the haystack, but we realized that if we qualify people as low risk, that we could actually enhance both the security regime and the trade facilitation and movement of people across the border, and that they were not really mutually exclusive vehicles. So in fact, there is a real role for the Nexus, and now incorporated with the Global Entry program, to build in public health dimensions to it and facilitate the movement of low risk people across the border. We have the data infrastructure constructed. It's still bifurcated far too much, but we could actually utilize the Nexus and Global Entry databases to add a field that would make clear the status, the low risk status of particular travelers. And that would go very far, I think, in starting to resume normalcy at the border as we wait for the vaccinations to have their effect, which likely will take 6 months to a year, if Juliet's correct, and I think she is. So yes, I think trusted traveler programs are a one channel for actually accelerating a resumption of cross-border movement of people.
Can I just say
Excellent.
something though? Oh, sorry.
No, please, Juliet.
Because I do think that both Marta and Alan's discussions about technology are really important from the fourth phase of vaccine distribution. For full disclosure, I work with some of the private companies that are now involved with this. And okay, so you have the four phases are demand, getting over vaccine hesitancy, which is a community effort and stakeholder engagement and all that stuff, depending on the community. But we're seeing good polling now, which was anticipated. Allocation, which is still under debate, and Canada is making different choices than us, and that seems to me fair that these different nations will pick different pools depending on their culture and history. Distribution, which you saw starting to roll out of Kalamazoo yesterday. And then the fourth, which we don't talk about, is verification. What does our post-vaccine world look like? And how do you want to utilize this identification technology so you don't have redundancies? But on the other hand, very similar to what Alan was describing, and no one's talking about it yet, and everyone's going to act all surprised. But the world is going to be divided, as we see with when we used to travel with burdened and unburdened people, that there will be burdened and unburdened classes, those who have the vaccine and those who either don't now or will never. And airlines are going to begin to prohibit, Qantas has already said it's going to by the end of the year, by 2021, no vaccine, no ride. And I would anticipate, the Japan Olympics, which is set to go on late July, early August, spectators and athletes, all proof of vaccination. Anyway, so I find it fascinating because the question is, can we, as we think about the globe moving again and these networks of travel, can we have to build a very fast verification system, and with all sorts of concerns about privacy and stuff like that. But it's going to happen, people. And I feel like anytime I say it to someone, their jaw drops, and I'm like, you have a driver's license, don't you? But because it's health information, I think people get nervous, but it's the only way forward.
Well said. And Chap, could I bring you into this conversation and maybe ask you about a related question, which is, given risk management, where do we want ideally these decisions to be made? Is this a frontline officer decision? Or as with terrorist threats, do we have a central screener that's looking for patterns and informing the process? Like, how much discretion do we want to put on officers who may not be able to tell a fake vaccination certificate from a real one, or how hard it is to determine situational issues?
Yeah, no, that's a central question. So Alan referenced haystacks, and I think it's still the same metaphor. I mean, finding the bad thing in the huge flow of goods and people is like looking for a needle in a haystack, or like a field of haystacks where the needle is straw colored. It's usually very hard to find the contraband or the terrorist or the drug smuggler or whatever amidst this vast flow. And so one way we get better at it are through these vetted traveler programs, which I think was suggested, can be applied in the case of infectious disease through passports or similar mechanisms to identify low-risk people, right? Passports showing that you are in fact vaccinated, or that you've already had the disease, or for whatever reason you're not contagious. But there is the other half of it, which in this case the analogy would be to contact tracing, right? And to be able to follow people who we find out after they've traveled are in fact high risk, and identify those who they might have come in contact with for enough time to pass on whatever the pathogen is. And so I think that brings up, as Juliet was suggesting, this central dilemma in Homeland Security, which applies across all the mission sets of privacy. And different governments have approached this very differently, because allowing the government to hold private medical data about someone, and locational data and other metadata, is enormously beneficial in the Homeland Security context across mission sets. But people are very leery of that, and particularly, I think, in the United States, very, very leery of that. We should, I think, step back a little bit, and Steve Bunnell, who is the chief counsel at DHS, writes the chapter on privacy in the book, and he really offers an alternative paradigm for how we should think about these privacy issues, which is one of harm reduction. And if we can reduce, say, the amount of privacy violations that come from physical searches or unpleasant interactions with officials of the state by surrendering personal information, with the confidence that that information will only be used for the purpose for which it was given, and that the government will prove a good custodian of that data, we'll be better off. But that depends, crucially, on the government doing those two things. And right now, our Homeland Security apparatus is not set up that way. It's set up to absorb a great deal of information, quote, just in case. And the government, in the United States at least, has proved a lousy custodian of all kinds of data, personal data. In fact, my data, I think Alan's as well, are in the hands of the Chinese secret services because we were part of that OPM hack. And that doesn't inspire any confidence. But I think if we could establish that confidence, then we would be in a much better situation to tackle the privacy issues with respect to infectious disease, but also a whole slew of Homeland Security missions.
Excellent, and especially with the new hack today, I think people are thinking about cybersecurity quite a bit. Marta, Liardi, Anderson, did you want to jump in on this question?
Thanks, Chris. Just real quick. I think Chap is absolutely right. I think when people start to see that there's value for giving up personal information and that government does its best to keep it in a can with a lid and opens up that can only when they need it, I think that that is something that needs to be considered in the era of COVID-19. I would also say that Canadians are probably more used to having their health records in a centralized location because of our national health system versus a more privatized system. So it's not unnatural for us to know that our health records are kept in certain areas. But I would also say that, and the Cross Border Institute just put out a paper, a policy paper with regard to testing at the land border crossing. Things can happen away from the border, away from ports of entry. And again, the book also talks about this, which I think is absolutely critical. There's a whole bunch of stuff that can happen away from a port of entry that could make those ports of entries much more efficient and effective. And I think when you look at COVID and testing, before everybody's vaccinated and before we might have a record of it, perhaps there's a way to do that and do it efficiently and then re-engage with this flow of people.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm, as always, a little bit sad to report that we're running out of time and we have more really good questions, so we could be doing this for a lot longer. I'm going to pick one of the questions we have from our audience, which I think is a great wrap-up question. So imagine that each and every one of you has had the chance to brief President-elect Biden and his administration incoming, or Prime Minister Trudeau. What do you think in this space, coming out of this book, what would be your top recommendations? What should they work on first if you were able just to have one or two suggestions? I'll go in the order that we presented. Juliet, do you want to open?
Okay, so the one would be immediate, one would be long-term. So one is, what's my supply chain look like to get us out of the pandemic? Because this is the thing I'm less worried about today. I'm worried about March and April. I don't know how many needles there are. I don't know how many. So that's my immediate. My longer term, I think, will be a little bit different. So I'm just given what we know President-elect Biden's priorities are. This is going to be hearsay. I would get rid of the Stafford Act and rethink disaster management in an age of climate change, so that we stop paying people for living in harm's way. And saying blow up the Stafford Act is sufficiently controversial that people will pay attention, but we can't do this anymore. We cannot have these disasters and then everyone just, goes back. So I think that's a really exciting area that I hope Secretary Kerry looks at from the Homeland perspective.
Excellent. Alan Berson, what would you have?
I think we really need to look at a short-term problem in the context of the COVID and resuming the consultations that will be critical to actually reigniting cross-border traffic. And that would lead to the longer-term solution that I suggest, which is really our relationship is not foreign. We have to stop treating this in the decision-making mode as an issue between a foreign, as a matter of foreign relations. And Juliet points out in her chapter, generally across the enterprise, is that the power of DHS largely is a convening power. It can get the right people to the table. And I would urge President Biden to actually let his Canadian colleagues and our Canadian colleagues actually take the lead. Look, Biden's got bigger problems than any president since Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, you could argue between the pandemic and the depression that was attendant to it, he's got a larger problem than Franklin Roosevelt faced in 1933, and he's doing so in the context of a politically riven nation that is only approximated in our history by what Lincoln faced when he arrived in Washington in 1861. So here's one where I would actually say to Prime Minister Trudeau, I'll back you. We'll support this, but we need initiative to come, and we need it to come from Canada now in terms of building back this cross-border vibrant traffic. We'll cooperate, but we actually need a convening as a first order of business.
I'm going to turn to you now, Chap Lawson, but before I do, I've been reminded by my my excellent team that we're supposed to go to 5:30. So here I am trying to wrap everything up. We've got more time. So we'll ask you more good questions, but everyone stay tuned. We have more time for this discussion. I don't know what I was thinking, probably that I wanted a drink.
I had this great wrap-up answer, but okay. So everything they said, absolutely. And I should just mention that having Alan and Juliet brief the incoming president isn't fanciful at all. It's not really a hypothetical question in that case. In my case, it is hypothetical, purely. I don't anticipate briefing him. But if I were, you already know I'm a zealot on collaborative border management. So I won't talk about that. And you already know, I think the book calls for a paradigm shift on the way we approach privacy. So I won't talk about that. But those would be two of my main points. I think one thing we need to do is imagine how the federal government, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, can do a better job engaging U.S. civil society. So we've created this apparatus that often feels quite distant and alien. In many cases, there are successful partnerships, but in others, there aren't. And TSA and CBP, as Peter Neffinger writes in our book, are really the retail face of the federal government, besides the post office, for the average American. And that is not historically a pretty friendly face. So we need to find some way to make the face more friendly without compromising the mission, but also to reach out and to unleash the energy and entrepreneurial zeal that the American people have, and turn it to making Homeland Security challenges go away, right? Or diminish significantly. So I think, and the last thing I'll just say is cyber. There are many paradigm shifts we recommend in this book. I already suggested collaborative border management and privacy, but cyber is another. I think, and I guess I would say critical infrastructure protection more generally. And we just don't have the right paradigm right now. We are approaching these issues from one of a kind of classic regulatory mindset, And that simply doesn't work in the cyber domain for lots of reasons. We can discuss them in the future, but that's something we need to move away from as rapidly as possible. And it's the job of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under the Department of Homeland Security, to effect that paradigm shift.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, Marta, you would probably be the one to brief Prime Minister Trudeau or perhaps Minister Blair. What of that would you underscore? Or hearing that the US president is thinking about all of those things, what do you think Canada needs to think a bit more about?
You know, in a previous life, Chris, I was able to brief a prime minister on border issues and ministers as well. So it's not an unnatural role for me to undertake. But I would certainly echo what Alan said, that there's an opportunity for Canada to take a lead in looking at some of the ongoing Canada-US and trade corridor issues that are not new and that areas where we could be doing better. And to bring back, I think, that willingness to engage and collaborate with experts in the field and with stakeholders and have a continuous dialogue that has no beginning, middle, or an end. I think one thing that COVID has demonstrated to us again is that without a continuous dialogue, we are caught with gaps in our understanding. Some people might call that a lack of education on how goods and people and services and funds move across borders and through supply chains. And take the opportunity to drill down on those issues and come up with those collaborative ideas that worked so well after 9/11. And I want to just put out there real quick, some of the private sector, I think it was Chap that said, let the private sector do what the private sector does so well, and let them inform some of the work that needs to get done. The Canada-US Business Association was formed very quickly after 9/11 between Southeast Michigan and Southwest Ontario. It's still in existence today, and it brings forward some really amazing participation with regard to the ongoing issues between Canada-US land border crossings. So it's really quite something when you let the, or not let, but listen to the private sector and what their issues are, what some of their solutions could be, and how the government could fit into that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have another question that's come in, and it relates to this question of confidence building. Canada and the United States are jointly restricting access to the border, and they have they've been renewing those restrictions on a every 30-day basis. Can we perhaps envision something that provides a bit more nuance, or maybe a date for ending them rather than just renewing them every 30 days from a business planning point of view and from the point of view of a lot of citizens who are trying to get on with their lives? Is there anything that we can tell them if the departments wanted to, or do you think that we are going to be doing this on a rolling basis for the foreseeable future? Does anyone want to field that? Alan.
So the first thing to do is to actually advise people that, in fact, if the vaccine takes 6 months to a year, that this is going to be a continued problem, but not to deal with it the way we have, which is simply not to deal with it. I think if there were an announcement of a convening and an ongoing consultation that would make recommendations of the kind that the task force at the Wilson Center will be making, and that there was a commitment to implementing them over time as they were accepted, that people would recognize that this obviously has to be dealt with incrementally for the foreseeable future, and that but that there would be some sense of progress, and a number of these ideas that we've talked about here could be implemented. and people would start to see that that change was happening. I think that would go a long way in assuring the public, and particularly cross-border communities, that in fact someone was working on the problem, and that there would be solutions. They wouldn't be complete solutions at once, but that over a period of the next year, we would see a steady increase in the number of people who were permitted to cross because they were able to demonstrate low risk in an acceptable fashion. So yeah, I think we shouldn't expect that suddenly the removal of the Title 42 restrictions in effect from the US side are going to happen. But I think we actually have to start instilling confidence in the public that there's a process, a deliberative process underway to remedy the situation.
So speaking of building public confidence, apparently we were supposed to end at 5. I've had all this confusion.
Jeff and I both are on dinner duty, and we're both like, we're sleeping on the sofas tonight. We were like,
Oh, well, Alan was so nice in saying that the Wilson Center's task force might help, but this is not a good confidence building measure. I'm just gonna ping you with one more question, and that is about what we would have been talking about without COVID.
yeah.
The departments were thinking about pre-clearance, cargo pre-clearance and greater pre-clearance, doing more things off the border. What happens to that agenda from before the pandemic? Does it have to wait now, or can we be chewing gum and walking at the same time, trying to do a bit of both? I realize that you have to do triage at a certain point, but what about the agenda that we were dealing with prior to all of this? Juliet, and if you could, this will be your wrap up. So your big finish.
So, I mean, I think my mind, but for COVID, I'll give my vote, which is, and we're seeing it today, is we've got a white nationalism problem. Canada does well, but not like us, that is transnational, transborder, and is I think the greatest violent Homeland Security threat ideology that both of our nations face, and I think it needs to be addressed, not forgotten under the weight of COVID or the dismantling of some of these other things that Secretary Designate Mayorkas is going to have to do.
Alan?
Yeah, I would focus on this dialogue, the institutionalization of dialogue. We need to encourage the NGOs, the academic centers like Marta's, centers like yours, Chris, to actually continue developing the agenda, because this is not, we are not going to consign to this forever. And public policy is such that if you're not ready when the opportunity presents itself, it doesn't come back around very quickly. So yes, we should continue to be working on the agenda from my perspective, with an increasingly North American perspective, with the idea that actually, as the world reshapes itself into a multi-layered, multipolar international order, given the erosion of the post-World War II liberal order that we're now in the middle of, North America will be critical to both Canada and the United States, and to Mexico going forward. So that agenda, the pre-clearance agenda, the trade agenda, the security agenda, the cybersecurity agenda, all of this is critical. But we should recognize that more and more, as we move into this new world order, as it's evolving, we're better off doing it together. We're better off doing it as a North American bloc and region than doing it separately. So I think, yes, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we can actually also project into the future. The North America that should be developing.
I
like
cannot
that
improve
theme.
upon Alan's answer, so I'll,
Sure.
I'll merely say thank you to you all at the Wilson Center for having us, and it was a great pleasure.
Excellent. And Marta, any last thoughts from the Canadian perspective?
I'm with Chap. I think Alan's answer is spot on. I think it has to be a continuous focus on, let's face it, the US is still Canada's #1 trading partner. It is the amount of commercial traffic between our two countries outweighs any kind of trade we do with any other country. The integration of our economies cannot be matched. It's interesting sometimes when you talk to some folks who think that we need to diversify trade, and it goes to that, can we chew gum and walk at the same time? Yes, we need to diversify trade, but not at the expense of forgetting about our #1 trading partner. And how do we further enhance that relationship? And we can only do that by making our borders, which is a sticking point, more efficient, more effective, less thick, make those haystacks smaller, and hopefully, Chap, the needle in the haystack is not the same color as the haystack. So.
Thank you very much, Marta Liardi Anderson from the Cross Border Institute at the University of Windsor. And thanks to our panel, Alan Berson, Juliet Kayam, Chap Lawson, who are the co-editors of the book, Beyond 9/11, Homeland Security for the 21st Century, available now from MIT Press. A great Christmas gift or a holiday gift if you are in the shopping mode. There are always people are hard to buy for. I want to thank our audience, and I want to thank all of you on the panel for bringing this important conversation to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks very much, and hopefully we'll move beyond 9/11 and beyond this sudden death overtime in the panel.
Good end. Thank you so much, Chris and Marta. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Everyone.